The Prime Minister is set to announce new laws to clamp down on migrant crossings. Sunak says he and senior aides at the Home Office have drawn up new laws to stop lawyers using the right to family life and legislation created to combat modern slavery to stop their clients being deported. And writing in The Sun on Sunday, Home Secretary Suella Braverman says enough is enough. The British people want this solved. They're sick of tough talk and inadequate action. We must stop the boats, she said. The law would give powers to the Home Secretary to remove anyone who arrives on a small boat as soon as reasonably practical to Rwanda or to a safe third-party country. Joining me now to discuss this is broadcaster Darren Grimes and former editor of the Labour List, Peter Edwards. Darren, this is an announcement about an announcement, is it not? I mean, I'm bored of these announcements.
Indeed, yes. We hear this every other week, don't we now? Ultimately, we had a case in this country where an individual who we were set to deport wasn't actually deported because a bunch of Labour Party MPs got together and said, how outrageous is this? Human rights of this individual are breached. And he wasn't deported. He went on to commit a very serious crime with a blade in this country. And there are instances like this where we're talking about an issue of national security, Calvin, and I don't think it's given the seriousness or acted with severity that it's actually required to keep the public safe. So the public watching this are totally in step with you, Calvin, in saying, I'm sick of hearing fancy words and rhetoric on this. I want action. And I think it's time that we got that.
And I'll come to you in a moment, Peter, but I think you're spot on here, Darren, in that the public don't feel safe and the public seem to be sick and tired of all these announcements without the action to back it up. But it seems that Priti Patel and Suella Braverman and Boris Johnson and all the Conservatives that are in touch with the public know this. So what do you think is the reason that nothing's happened so far?
Well, we're about to get into talk later on about the civil service, and I do think that there is a real stopgap in actually getting things done in the Home Office and in other departments because the civil service is swinging to the left, right? They think that anyone who argues for robust border controls is some kind of swivel-eyed bigot. Right. And there are so many ways in which even a Conservative Party with an 80-seat majority doesn't seem to be able to get a grip of Britain's borders. Look at the southern border right now. It's more open than a sponge. It's bizarre.
OK. Peter, I want tough borders. I want illegal immigrants deported. I want to make sure our country is safe. Am I a hard-right bigot?
No, I don't think you're a bigot at all, but I want to pick up on Darren's point, because I think Darren is making things up, essentially, to suggest that Labour MPs have any suggestion in interview immigration cases is not true. The laws are passed by Parliament, where there's a Conservative majority, and the law is enforced by police and the courts. So Labour MPs, they can appeal, just as Tories can appeal on behalf of individual cases, but it's not decided by members of Parliament. So that is a nonsense. In terms of what we've heard from the government today, my worry is that it's trying to re-announce a certain soundbite, essentially, that there's a small boats crisis, so we're doing something. But there's already law against illegal immigrants. That's why it's called illegal migration. And then if government are trying to do anything that cuts across UN-enforced rights to asylum, they won't be allowed to, and it will be challenged and probably defeated in court. Finally, let's go back to Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges. One of the pledges wasn't to tackle the small boats crisis. The pledge was purely to pass some laws, which is a much narrower pledge. He's not saying, I'll fix the small boat crisis. He was saying, I'll pass some laws in Parliament, then something might happen afterwards. And I think this is Sunday newspaper territory. Tories feel we've got to say something, we've got to look tough. What does it actually lead to?
OK, I agree with you that it's some red meat that they're throwing out there, but Darren, I want to give you the opportunity to reply because Peter said you're making stuff up and it's nonsense.
Absolutely. There were a handful, more than a handful, Calvin, of Labour Party MPs that did sign a letter calling on this bloke and others to not be deported. It speaks to what Peter's chums in the Labour Party would actually do if they were in office, which is the square root of naff all, to be frank, when it comes to our borders.
How is that any different to the Conservatives?
Well, I agree with that. I accept that. But I think when you've got Yvette Cooper as Home Secretary standing up with posters virtue signalling saying refugees are welcome, well, actually, most of these people coming over aren't refugees, actually, in the definition that fair-minded people in Britain would be willing to accept. They're economic migrants in most cases, and the Labour Party, I think, would be the champion of these economic migrants.
So, Darren, briefly, just sorry to dive in.
Well, without getting into tit for tat for this, I'd rather bring you into something more constructive, Peter, on the ECHR and the UN. You mentioned that we can't implement any laws because we have superior laws to our own. that are cutting through our illegal immigration problem. How do we get around that?
Well, that's not quite what I said. The British government can pass laws, but certain things that erode the rights of asylum seekers, I believe, will fall foul of the UN Charter. But your question is essentially, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
So I think about a year ago, Labour said we should have closer cooperation with France. Now Boris Johnson has gone and Liz Truss has gone. It looks like that's happening. And let's not be partisan about everything. Rishi Sunak has worked to establish a better relationship with the President of France. I would say that's good for Britain, it's good for France, and it's good for safety. But maybe more working with partners and more actually trying to enforce the existing law rather than writing angry columns in Sunday newspapers is the answer.
Darren, what do you think is the answer to this?
Well, look, I mean, we've given the French more millions than I think Chanel probably, makes in any given year. I think it's ridiculous to suggest that President Macron has an interest in actually not allowing these boats to get into the English Channel, right? France clearly doesn't want these people either. They are economic migrants seeking to get to Britain to make a bit of money, and I don't blame them for wanting to do that. But ultimately, we are a nation state that should be able to enforce its own border policies. So we've got to actually look at globalist outfits like the UN and, frankly, like the ECHR and say that if Brexit was to mean anything, we've got to look at leaving the ECHR in particular, because we can't have a border policy or enforce a border policy without doing so.
For me, this was the point of Brexit. We shouldn't have no laws from a foreign land that are superseding laws in this land. If we say we want to deport illegal immigrants, we should be able to do so in our own country without the European Convention or the UN saying otherwise.
Well, Britain can.
But we're not.
Don't
So
conflate
we clearly
asylum
can't.
and illegal immigration. They're different things.
Who is?
Britain.
I said illegal immigrants. I
Britain
didn't say asylum.
Britain can remove illegal immigrants. There's a separate point about challenges on asylum cases, but I don't think anyone reasonably could be against challenging asylum rulings.
But I think the only people conflating refugee claims and asylum seekers and illegal immigrants are these human rights lawyers, because most of the illegal immigrants we're trying to deport, they're saying, actually, no, they're refugees, they're asylum seekers. That's where the conflation is happening. That is the problem that we need to address. But thank you both.